More than a century ago, clerks sat at wooden desks under oil lamps, asking native families questions that would shape their future forever. Names, ages, parents, blood, status. Those answers were written onto enrollment cards that still carry power today. Between 1898 and 1914, the U.S. government created what became known as the Dawes Rolls. The goal was not cultural preservation. It was land division. Under the Dawes Act, communal tribal lands were broken into individual allotments. To receive land, citizens of the 5 civilized tribes, including the Cherokee Nation, had to be recorded on an official list. But the rolls did more than record names. They divided people into categories. Some were listed by blood. Others were placed on separate pages as freedmen, descendants of formerly enslaved black people held by Cherokee citizens before the Civil War. The ink on those pages created a racial boundary inside a sovereign nation. Today, that same document still shapes citizenship. The Cherokee Nation currently requires direct descent from an ancestor listed on the Dawes Rolls to qualify for citizenship. Not DNA tests, not family stories, not oral history, a federal-era document. And here is the tension. The rolls were compiled by U.S. agents, often under pressure, language barriers, and racial bias. Some families were misclassified. Some avoided enrollment altogether out of distrust. Others were recorded incorrectly. Yet the document remains a legal foundation. The status of Cherokee freedmen descendants became one of the most significant modern identity battles. In 2017, after years of legal conflict, the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court affirmed that descendants of freedmen listed on the rolls have the right to citizenship. A 19th-century treaty signed after the Civil War guaranteed it. So can a 100-year-old document decide who is Cherokee today? Legally, yes. Practically, yes. But morally and historically, the answer is more complex. The Dawes Rolls were never meant to define identity forever. They were tools of policy created during an era of forced assimilation. Yet today, thousands of people trace their belongings through those fragile enrollment cards. History, race, and law collided in the 1890s. The consequences are still unfolding, and the question remains: when sovereignty meets a federal record, who truly decides identity? In 1893, Congress created the Dawes Commission, a federal body tasked with dismantling tribal land ownership in Indian Territory. Its mission was not cultural preservation, it was assimilation. Communal lands held by tribes like the Cherokee Nation were to be divided into individual allotments. But before land could be divided, people had to be defined. Between 1898 and 1914, federal agents compiled what became known as the Dawes Rolls to receive land. Individuals had to apply and prove their identity to U.S. officials. That process produced thousands of enrollment cards, documents that still carry legal weight today. Cherokee applicants were placed into categories: Cherokee by blood, Cherokee freedmen, minor or intermarried whites. These labels were not chosen by Cherokee communities. They were assigned by federal agents. And here is the critical fact: race was often recorded based on appearance, local reputation, or testimony filtered through interpreters. Agents made judgment calls. Some families, who had lived as Cherokee citizens for generations, were placed in separate racial categories. In certain cases, siblings standing before the same commission were recorded differently, one marked by blood, another listed as freedmen. On paper, a line was drawn. The freedmen designation referred to formerly enslaved black people held by Cherokee citizens before the Civil War and their descendants. After the war, an 1866 treaty guaranteed them Cherokee citizenship. But when the Dawes Rolls were created decades later, that shared citizenship was separated into racial columns. The human cost was quiet but permanent. A clerk's ink created a paper identity that would outlive the people in the room. What was meant as an administrative step in a land policy became something far more enduring. Today, citizenship in the Cherokee Nation still requires direct descent from someone listed on the Dawes Rolls, not DNA. Not oral history, a federal record. This is the core tension. A classification system designed by the U.S. government during an era of forced assimilation became the foundation of modern tribal citizenship. The debate did not begin in the 21st century. It began at a desk in the 1890s, when identity was translated into categories. And those categories never disappeared. Before the Civil War, the story is uncomfortable but documented. Some citizens of the Cherokee Nation enslaved African Americans. This was not unique among the so-called 5 civilized tribes, but it complicates the modern debate about identity. Slavery existed inside a native nation that was under pressure from U.S. expansion. When the Civil War ended, everything shifted. In 1866, the United States and the Cherokee Nation signed a new treaty often referred to as the Treaty of 1866. One of its most consequential provisions granted formerly enslaved people and their descendants full tribal citizenship within the Cherokee Nation. Not partial recognition, not limited status, full citizenship. That promise was written into binding law. For generations afterward, freedmen families voted in Cherokee elections, owned property, attended schools, and participated in civic life as citizens. They built churches, raised children, and passed down stories that blended African American and Cherokee histories. Their belonging was not theoretical, it was lived. Then came the enrollment era. When federal agents compiled the Dawes Rolls at the turn of the 20th century, freedmen were listed on separate pages from those labeled Cherokee by blood. The treaty had guaranteed citizenship, but the enrollment categories introduced a racial distinction into the record. On paper, the separation was administrative. In reality, it planted a seed. For decades, that seed lay mostly dormant. Freedmen descendants continued to identify as Cherokee citizens. But in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as tribes strengthened sovereignty and clarified citizenship rules, the language of by blood began to carry new legal weight. Here is where the conflict intensifies. If citizenship is tied to descent from someone listed as Cherokee by blood on a federal roll, what happens to those whose ancestors were placed on the freedmen page despite a treaty promising equal citizenship? The debate is not just about ancestry. It is about the meaning of a treaty, the authority of a sovereign nation, and the legacy of slavery within native communities. Freedmen descendants are not outsiders to Cherokee history. They are part of it, and that reality forces a difficult question. When law, race, and sovereignty intersect, whose definition of belonging prevails? In 2007, more than a century after the Dawes Rolls were created, their categories returned to the center of Cherokee politics. That year, voters within the Cherokee Nation approved a constitutional amendment redefining citizenship. The new requirement was clear. To qualify, an applicant had to prove direct descent from an ancestor listed as Cherokee by blood on the Dawes Rolls. The immediate impact was profound. Descendants whose ancestors were listed only under the Freedmen category despite generations of recognized citizenship lost their status as Cherokee citizens. Thousands were affected. Voting rights, access to certain tribal programs, and formal political belonging were suddenly in question. Supporters of the amendment framed it as an issue of sovereignty. For them, the core principle was self-determination. A federally recognized tribe has the inherent authority to define its own citizenship. They argued that lineage, specifically descent from those identified as Cherokee by blood, was a legitimate and necessary standard to preserve national identity. Opponents saw something different. They pointed to the Treaty of 1866, the post-Civil War agreement that explicitly granted citizenship to formerly enslaved people and their descendants. That treaty, they argued, was not symbolic, it was binding law. It did not condition citizenship on blood quantum or racial classification. It recognized freedmen as citizens of the Cherokee Nation in their own right. The conflict was no longer just internal. It moved into federal courts, congressional hearings, and national headlines. Civil rights organizations, legal scholars, and political leaders weighed in. At its core, the debate asked two difficult questions. Does tribal sovereignty allow a nation to redefine citizenship even if it appears to conflict with a historic treaty? And can a racial category created by federal agents in the early 1900s override a Reconstruction-era promise of equality? For many Cherokee citizens, this was not abstract politics. It involved neighbors, relatives, and shared history. The 2007 vote forced the nation to confront its past slavery, federal intervention, racial classification, and decide what those histories mean in the present. Blood versus treaty, sovereignty versus obligation, identity versus law. The issue was no longer confined to enrollment cards. It had become a defining moment in modern Native governance, and the country was watching. In 2017, the long-running conflict reached a legal turning point. After years of litigation, a federal court ruled that the Cherokee Nation must honor the guarantees made in the Treaty of 1866. The decision affirmed that descendants of Cherokee freedmen are entitled to citizenship rights under that treaty. The ruling did not rewrite history, it enforced it. At the center of the case was a straightforward legal question. Did the 1866 treaty grant full and permanent citizenship to formerly enslaved people and their descendants? The court concluded that it did. The language of the treaty did not condition citizenship on racial classification or by blood designation. It recognized freedmen and their descendants as citizens. The legal weight of that agreement mattered. Treaties between tribal nations and the United States are not symbolic documents. Under U.S. law, they carry binding authority. By affirming the treaty's force, the court reinforced a principle that stretches back to Reconstruction: promises written into law must be honored. The impact was immediate. Freedmen descendants regained citizenship status. Voting rights were restored. Access to tribal programs and services resumed. Families who had lived in uncertainty for years were formally recognized once again as citizens of the Cherokee Nation. But the decision did not erase the deeper debate. For some, the ruling represented justice on overdue recognition of a treaty obligation and shared history. For others, it raised difficult questions about sovereignty and the power of a tribal nation to define its own membership standards without federal interference. And this is where the story becomes more than a legal headline. Who defines belonging? Is it ancestry, measured through enrollment records created by federal agents in the early 1900s? Is it treaty rights, negotiated in the aftermath of the Civil War? Or is it community-lived participation, shared institutions, and generational ties? The 2017 decision settled a legal dispute. It did not end the philosophical one. More than 150 years after the Treaty of 1866, and more than a century after the Dawes Rolls, the Cherokee Nation continued to navigate the intersection of sovereignty, history, and identity. The court answered one question. The deeper question about what belonging truly means remains open. This story is bigger than one nation or one set of documents. The Cherokee Freedmen debate touches on fundamental questions about sovereignty, identity, and the lasting weight of history. At its heart is tribal sovereignty, the principle that native nations have the right to govern themselves, set their own rules, and define citizenship. But sovereignty does not exist in a vacuum. It intersects with federal law, treaties, and centuries of external interference. When the U.S. government compiled the Dawes Rolls, it wasn't just recording names. It was inserting a colonial framework into tribal life, creating racial categories that had never existed in the same rigid form within the Cherokee Nation. Today, those same categories, Cherokee by blood and freedmen, still shape who can claim membership. Families split across paper lines, siblings divided by ink, and descendants impacted generations later. The issue isn't abstract. It affects voting rights, access to tribal services, and a sense of belonging for real people with real stories. The debate also raises broader questions about race versus citizenship. Can ancestry, filtered through a classification system imposed by outsiders, override lived history and participation in a community? The Dawes Rolls were created under pressure, often by agents who knew little of the people they were recording. Yet their work continues to influence modern policy and law, showing how the past refuses to stay buried. For viewers aged 35 to 65 plus, the story resonates on multiple levels. It forces us to ask, can government paperwork ever truly define identity? Can rules written a century ago account for the full complexity of families, culture, and history? And if sovereignty is supposed to mean self-determination, why do external classifications still carry legal weight? This isn't just a historical footnote. It's a reminder that the legacies of colonialism, slavery, and bureaucracy are not distant, they are living realities. The Freedmen struggle shows how history, law, and identity collide in ways that are deeply human, often painful, and morally complex. At the end of the day, the Cherokee Nation story reflects a universal tension. How do communities reconcile their past with the need to define themselves today? Who decides belonging: the government, a document, or the people who live in history? It's a question that resonates far beyond Oklahoma, far beyond one tribe, and far beyond one legal case. History is not just in books. It lives in families, laws, and in the decisions that shape who gets to belong. Behind the legal debates, constitutional amendments, and federal rulings, the Cherokee Freedmen issue is profoundly human. This isn't just history or policy, it's the lived reality of families whose identities, rights, and futures were determined by documents written over a century ago. Across generations, families have felt the weight of these decisions. Elders clutch enrollment cards, Dawes Rolls, and family papers, fragile artifacts that carry the authority of both history and law. To them, these documents are not mere paper. They are proof of belonging, of citizenship, of a lifetime of cultural and civic participation. For some, they are the difference between recognition and exclusion. Community life illustrates the stakes. Gatherings at tribal centers, churches, and schools are more than social events. They are affirmations of membership, shared history, and continuity. When citizenship is questioned, so too are access to critical rights, voting in tribal elections, eligibility for health care programs, housing assistance, educational scholarships, and participation in cultural institutions. A single legal or administrative decision can ripple across the lives of entire families, affecting daily life and long-term opportunity. For younger generations, the implications are both practical and emotional. Growing up knowing your ancestry and heritage is one thing. Having that identity legally questioned or revoked is another. Children of freedmen families are taught to honor their Cherokee roots, yet they may face bureaucratic barriers that undermine the very community they call home. Citizenship here is not symbolic, it is generational and personal. Even today, families recount the tension and uncertainty they experienced when votes, court cases, and enrollment decisions threatened to strip them of belonging. The human cost is visible in quiet ways, in conversations about inheritance, in anxious waits for official notices, and in the emotional labor of preserving family history against the backdrop of external classification. This debate reminds us that law and policy are never abstract, they touch real lives. Identity is lived as much as it is recorded. When history, race, and sovereignty intersect, the consequences are deeply felt. It is a story of resilience, of families navigating complex legacies, and of communities striving to honor their past while protecting the future. The Cherokee Freedmen issue is a living testament. History is not confined to books. It lives in families, shapes opportunities, and defines what it means to belong. And for those affected, the stakes are as immediate as they are enduring. More than a century ago, a federal clerk sat at a desk in Indian Territory, quill in hand, writing names on sheets of paper that would become the Dawes Rolls. At the time, it may have seemed like routine bureaucratic work, a way to organize land allotments, calculate shares, and track membership. Yet that simple act of recording names carried consequences that no one could have fully anticipated. Today, those same names still decide who belongs. They influence voting rights, access to health care, housing, scholarships, and the recognition of centuries-old cultural ties. The story of the Cherokee Freedmen demonstrates how history can be both tangible and invisible. Tangible in the form of faded cards, handwritten letters, and legal documents. Invisible in the way these records continue to shape human lives long after the ink has dried. For families, this is not abstract, it is personal. Grandparents holding enrollment cards, parents navigating bureaucracies, children learning that their identity is contingent on categories created by outsiders. They all live with the legacy of a document meant to standardize and simplify a complex culture. Yet the debate is bigger than one tribe. It asks us to examine the tension between sovereignty and justice, law and morality, bloodlines and lived experience. A vote within a sovereign nation, a court ruling, or a political amendment can change legal recognition, but can it alter cultural identity? Can a person's belongings be revoked when their family has lived and participated as full members for generations? The history of the Dawes Rolls shows that even well-intentioned systems can create lasting inequities. A flawed record, once made official, becomes a powerful instrument capable of excluding, dividing, or redefining entire communities. And yet, there is hope in reflection. Each legal challenge, treaty enforcement, and family story forces communities to confront the question of what belonging truly means. It reminds us that identity is more than paperwork. It is memory, participation, heritage, and recognition. The Dawes Rolls may have drawn lines in ink, but culture, lived experience, and moral obligation have the power to redraw them in human terms. Pause, reflect, because this story leaves more questions than answers. If citizenship is political, can identity ever be purely cultural? When a treaty promises equality, can a vote override it? And if the list was flawed from the start, what does justice look like now? These questions are not academic, they are urgent, human, and enduring. They challenge not only the Cherokee Nation, but all of us to think critically about the legacies of history, the weight of law, and the meaning of belonging.